Okay, thank you, Anderson, and members of the board. I'm Bruno, and I'm going to talk a bit about my research here. The title is big, it's harnessing high-level concepts, visual and auditory features for violence detection in videos. Essentially, is how can we use artificial intelligence to detect violent scenes in videos? So, to start, uh, I'm going to show a presentation outline here. For this presentation, we're going to follow. First, I'm going to introduce the problem and the motivations to research it. Then we'll talk about the actual research questions and some of its challenges. Then we'll briefly take a look at what the community achieved in this field before going into more detail about the methodology that we're proposing here. And then we'll discuss some of the results of our experiments and reach some conclusions about our research questions. So to start, why detect violence? Violent behavior is a key aspect of what we call sensitive media. Scenes that either is not suited for particular audience or is the interest of analysis and investigations. Video is not only easier to access through the internet, but it's easier to produce from mobile cameras. So it's not surprising that we have countless hours of videos uploaded to the internet every day, and there's a demand for automated video ranking and tagging systems that can check if these videos contain sensitive scenes. We also have the case of surveillance systems that are generally ineffective to detect violence and usually require a human to go through the entire footage. For a large-scale system, it's impossible for a human operator to track all the cameras at the same time. So an automated system can help not only detect the abnormal behavior in real time, but also save time when reviewing past footage. But before we actually detect violence, we first need to know what is violence. What are we trying to detect here? And violence is a very subjective concept. What is violence in general? The answer may vary from person to person. So what are we trying to find? A specific kind of violence instead. So what characteristics are we looking for? And all of these brings us to our research questions. So the first question is how to define violence in terms that a computer can understand. We have to first define violence for us humans before we train a computer to do so. But the way we understand violence is very subjective, so what makes it hard to translate for a computer? We can try to detect more specific kinds of violence, but then how do these different kinds of violence interact to enable a system that understands violence really in general? And lastly, we're dealing with videos. So this is an audiovisual media, so how can we use the maximum amount of information to help detect violence? So these are our research questions. So the first thing we need to do is this first part, to define violence. For this, we're going to first try to understand how experts define and classify violence. The World Health Organization have a pretty neat topology that classifies violence from the perspective of the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator of violence. From this, we can say that violent act is self-directed if the victim and the perpetrator are the same person, and this can be like suicide or self-abuse. If the victim and the perpetrator are different persons, we have interpersonal violence, and this can be further divided into family and community violence depending on the specific relationship between them. We can also have a violent act directed to not a specific person but to a collective of people. So this could be a terrorist act or when a government represses protests. From all of these, we can say that even among experts, the definition of violence is very complex. That's why we have to define better what kind of violence we're using in this work. To start, we're going to focus on physical violence. This is the kind that we can just look at an image and say there is a violent act being represented. So what kind of definition we used? We are basing our work in one of the largest violent scenes dataset available, the medieval VSD task dataset. And they present two types of definition. The first one is a scene is violent if it contains physical violence or accident resulting in human injury or pain. And this is an attempt of defining violence as objectively as possible. So a human watching a video can always come back to this definition when deciding if a scene is violent. And then we use the way that humans classify these scenes to train, in our case, a neural network to recognize these same scenes as violent. But the thing is, this definition, while being objective, leaves a lot of nuance out. For example, when we have a scene where a kid is portrayed training for a boxing match, we have human injury and pain being resulted of this. But do we classify this as violent? We can argue both ways. So the medieval VSD dataset, they have yet another definition. They have a second definition that says that a scene is violent if it contains physical violence, which one would not let an 8-year-old child see. So this is an attempt to broaden the scope of what a violent scene can be, but we still remain with some difficult cases. For example, in this scene, we have a man sleeping while holding a gun. Is it appropriate to let an 8-year-old child see this? We can argue both ways again. So since we need to settle on a definition, we're going to use this second definition mainly, that is more general. But it is important to keep in mind that this definition has some issues and can have different interpretations depending on who are we asking. So with this, how do the community has been researching violence detection? Violence detection comes from action recognition studies. The main methods, they were using old bag of visual words approach. And these methods, they combine several handcrafted features, descriptors of images to form a histogram of frequencies. And these histograms, they are used to support vector machines to be classified as violent or not. And from 2011 to 2015, the Medieval Benchmark Initiative, they hosted a violent scenes detection task competition. And most of the major improvements in the violent scenes detection field has come from these competitions they hosted. So in 2015, along with many handcrafted features, convolutional neural networks were used as another source of features. And the main idea was using the neural networks to get features from the data instead of obtaining features from established filters. So the use of neural networks actually improved the previous results and they started to become more popular. So the community started to use them more, and we had even more improvements, but not exactly in the medieval dataset. We had major improvements in other ones, which are actually older. These are datasets from 2011. The violent flows ones are from 2012, and the biggest of the three is the hockey fights. This dataset has 27 minutes of videos, and hockey fights is very specific dataset, short clips from hockey games. And violence in movies have a more varied scenes, but the violent ones are very different from non-violent. Here, the top row is non-violent and the bottom row is the violent scenes. They are very different. The violent flows focuses more on crowded scenes. So we have stadiums and crowded streets. And the new technique in this field, using neural networks, they opened a way for many works to have high accuracy in these datasets. The recent studies since 2016, the community had over 90% accuracy in all three of these datasets. They use all kinds of techniques such as bag of words and Fisher vector, neural networks that incorporate temporal information in deep learning. These are results in these datasets that not only makes us turn our attention to a harder to solve dataset, such as the medieval VST one, but they raise a question of why a machine can detect violence so accurately in these cases? So when we use features to describe an image to a machine, we rely on concrete descriptions. For example, a car have a metallic texture, have wheels and a box-like structure. A person have a head, arms and legs. All of these are concrete shapes that makes it easier for a computer to classify. And these classical datasets, they have some of this structure. A fight is a clash between two humans. You have a crowd that have different motions. A hockey scene, they have very concrete definitions of what is happening. So we can describe a fight, but that is not all what violence is. Violence can be a explicit fight or big explosion, but it can also be something subtle. We classify this scene as a violent scene. At what moment can we consider this scene violent? We want to find a method that can classify many aspects of violence, but we can just use violence as a standalone concept. We need to find concrete aspects of violence so we can use them to describe the bigger, more subjective ones. And there are many concepts of violence. In this work, we focus on 7 specific ones. Blood, cold arms, there are swords, and explosions, fights, fire, firearms, and gunshots. So all of these, they convey some kind of violent behavior on a scene. So we're going to use them individually to describe this more general concept of violence. So illustrating this with a graph is something like this. We first we detect each one individually, and then we use them to describe violence itself. This is the first step for our methodology, is to first detect these specific kinds of concepts, violence, and then we fuse them together. So how do we detect these subconcepts? We train neural networks to identify these from these objects and these actions from the images. But just analyzing these concepts, we can already see some differences in how to approach the task of detecting them. Some concepts, they convey the passage of time. So explosion, fights, and gunshots, there are concepts that don't make much sense if we're not detecting movement and how these actions are performed over time. For all of the other concepts, we can mainly still use images. Neural networks are good at detecting texture and color palettes, distinct shapes. But even though we use still images to detect explosions, fights, and gunshots, we believe that temporal information is a big part of what describes these concepts. So we have to represent these movements in a still frame. That neural networks mainly use still frames as input. So how can we represent movement in a still frame? One method is to make use of the 3-channel nature of an RGB image. First, we use the temporal robust features detector, that is a detector developed here in HICOD, to identify a set of frames centered at a point in the image that belongs to a specific movement. So we have these n images that form a single stream of movement, and then we can insert grayscale copies of 3 key frames into each color channel of a resulting image. First one, we can make, for example, we called an extremities combination. They put the first frame and the red channel, the last frame in the blue channel, and the central frame of movement in the green channel. And then we get this kind of image here. We can use also another type of combination that uses the 3 most central frames, 1 in each color channel. And the third combination that we had uses the central frame as the green channel and the averages of the first half of frames in the red channel and the averages of the last half of the frames in the blue channel. So uh, to get an idea of how this works in a video, we have this short sequence, for example, and we extract the central frame from this video, and we got this original frame, and then we got each of the three combinations that we talked about here. So this is one idea on how to use one image to convey movement, and we'll see how good they are later on. But there are other methods that we can use that are more consolidated in the literature, such as an optical flow. So optical flow uses vector gradients to describe how a pixel of the image moved from one frame to the next. Here we see a representation of the gradients in color with these three frames. We go, what are the differences between the first and the second frame here, and what are the differences between the second and the third frame here. So it calculates this, and we show here in color. Sometimes this can be better to detect how movement occurred from one frame to the next. And the optical acceleration is another descriptor that builds on top of the optical flow. So instead of calculating the displacement of a pixel from one frame to the next, it calculates the gradient of a pair of sequential optical flows, and we get something like this. This sometimes is better to detect sudden movements than optical flow itself, since the difference between two sequential frames can be very subtle, but the difference of how the objects moved, they can be more apparent. So to describe movement, we not only use the trough combinations, but we also use optical flow and optical acceleration here. But there's still some more information that we can think of extracting just by looking at the nature of our subconcepts. So we are detecting violence in videos, so we can use the audio information too. Some concepts, they have some distinct sound signals. Blood and fire are the ones that are harder to capture this, but all the others can be used for extracting the audio information. Here it's important to note that not all kinds of videos will have significant audio signals. Some will mask the audio with music, and security cameras often don't even capture audio. So that's why audio is hard to be considered a main feature, but it is a good complementary one. And to describe the audio information, we need descriptors that are robust to noise and background sounds. The features we calculate with audio are handcrafted features. The data-driven approach here is hard due to the very lack of annotated data. We don't have a lot of information from this to actually extract through just the data itself. And at first we extract the features from MFCCs and the chroma, Fourier transform, MEL spectrogram, and spectral contrast. These are all the features, and here's some examples of how they look like. After this, we also calculate some additional set of information, like the average of each ones, the standard deviation, the maximum and the minimum. And all of these features, they are then put through a neural network to actually get the final features that we used for classification. So with all of these features lined up, we have our method pipeline. So the idea here is to get each subconcept through an independent visual detector and an independent audio detector. So we have one visual network for blood, one visual network for fights, we have one for explosions, so on. We have also one audio network for each subconcept. And from these networks, we extract the features we extract here the features from the last fully connected layers of these networks, and then we concatenate them to then put through a fusion network. So we do this this fusion independently for the visual source and the audio networks, and then using the same fusion network we can get the features from each one, audio and each modality here, from the audio and from the video. We fuse them together again to get our final result for violence itself here. So we tested this method with 3 different visual networks. We'll talk about it a bit later. And the audio network here is not a deep network. It has only one hidden layer and has the same number of neurons as the size of the feature vectors. These are very simple signals and features. Deeper networks, they didn't provide much better results here. Our fusion network is not a deep network too. We designed one with 3 hidden layers. We used the grid search method to find the best number of hidden layers and neurons in each one. It's a feed-forward structure backpropagation algorithm here. But we'll see that this network classifies better than a deep one. And we use this fusion network not only to put together the final results, but each visual network from every subconcept and each audio network too. So how did we test this? Our main data set here was the medieval 2013 violence scenes detection task one. And these are mainly Hollywood movies. The training set is 17 movies. We have more than 2,000 minutes. The test set is 7 movies with 885 minutes. And we used this dataset because it was the largest dataset at the time, with annotation from several subconcepts, which helped us follow the progress of our individual subconcepts network. So the first set of experiments was with the input transformations using trough combinations and the optical flow and optical acceleration inputs. Here we can see the results of the classification accuracy for each subconcept. So we have blood and cold arms. We see it was expected to perform better with raw frames since they're not so dependent on movement, and we use the weights from the Inception pre-trained with the ImageNet database for transfer learning, which is very good at detecting general objects. And the explosions concept had a better result of the raw frames at a first glance. This is unexpected because it is an explosion, so we need movement. So we have to keep in mind here that we're dealing with a movie dataset, and many explosions are pictured in close-up, so we have many cuts that are widening the cut and prolonging the duration of explosion. And this changes the orientation of the movements, and probably that makes it easier for the network to detect explosions without this temporal information attached. For fights and fire, best results were using optical flow and optical acceleration, which is a good indication that incorporating this temporal information can help detect these kinds of concepts. Firearms, however, not only was our worst individual result, but the network had a better accuracy when using optical acceleration. And here we take into consideration that the movie with the most amount of positive frames for firearms is a war movie, and many firearms are portrayed alongside gunshots or erratic movements. So this could be the reason why the network performed better using the optical acceleration, and this this type of information here than just the raw frames. And we also here we have gunshots to compare with how it was much better detected with the optical acceleration for gunshots, since the gunshots is it's a very fast movement, and the difference between one frame and the other could be better detected with the optical acceleration one. So we also trained a network with the same inputs to detect violence. This results here is using the direct annotation from the dataset, which is the subject one we discussed about, where a scene is violent if you would not let an 8-year-old child watch. So all of these annotations, they are independent. A scene may be considered violent for the dataset, even if it's not positive for any of the individual subconcepts. So our best result here, it was with the trough combinations, the central combination with trough here, detecting violence, but it still is a very it's a worse result than with just using the concatenation. Concatenation is a method that, instead of using a fusion network, we just concatenate the last fully connected layer of each subconcept and feed it to the inception V4 again. So we detect each concept with this deep neural network, and then we concatenate the features from the last layer of them and feed it to the network, to another network again. And this is the concatenation method that we get better results than just classifying with the direct definition from the dataset. And fusion network is the results using our network to classify the features from each subconcept. So we can see here that our fusion network performed better in every scenario here, with every type of input manipulation. This is what I talked about, how the fusion network performed better than the inception here. All of these results, they are using the inception V4, except with the fusion network. The inception V4 we used mainly because it was the best performing network that we tested. But we are still dealing with concepts that naturally have temporal information. So we also tested our method with two different network architectures that takes time into consideration. The first one is the 3D convolutional network, C3D. This network uses 3D convolution. So instead of using a convolutional mask in a single frame, this network receives input as a set of sequential frames and uses a 3D mask. So it captures information from the same space through different frames here. The other network that we used is based on LSTMs, and they have the ability to remove or add information to the solid state. This allows the network to use information from past inputs to influence the current one. So we feed the network frames in sequence, and we use the LSTM as a last layer of a regular convolutional network to save computational time mainly. Our results with this time-based architecture, they were not better than just using the inception V4. Here is a brief overview of how they did, and our best results with the fusion was 69.2% accuracy, which was way worse than what we had with our inception V4 one. So here we can see that the optical acceleration is by far the best one, excepting for detect fights and explosions. But still, this kind of convinced us to, okay, we we agreed that we got better results with the inception, but the optical acceleration was better here, and even using just the concepts with the inception, we had better results with different kinds of input. There are some kinds of inputs that are better for specific subconcepts. Why don't we use a fusion for features extracted from the best performing inputs for each subconcept? So we used our results from the inception, and we get for blood, cold arms, and explosions, the raw frames were better. For firearms, fire, and gunshots, the optical acceleration was better. And for fights, the optical flow was the best kind of input that we had. So we can make a final fusion using the features from each of these different types of inputs. And this is what we get here. The best visual features for each one were these ones for each subconcept. And then we can make a fusion with them, and we get 75.3% accuracy, which is a little better than just using the same input altogether. And we get these also here. We also did just show our results with the audio features with our audio network. And these results, they only use the audio features. You can see that each individual ones, we had worse accuracy for each one individually, except when we use the violence definition directly. This we can explain with the dataset nature. It's movies, so it's very common that a sensitive scene is accompanied by a tense and distinct soundtrack. So it's easier to detect violence using the direct definition and not looking at the other concepts, just using the audio here. But then when we combine the visual features with the audio features, we got our best results for a final fusion, and making the case that audio can be used to complement visual features with our method. All of these experiments encourage us to, this modular approach is, we can use this modular approach to find violence, could be a good solution to how can we solve violence detection. But all of our subconcepts, they come from the same dataset. So in the final experiment, we used a specialized dataset for fights. This specialized dataset is the NTU-CCTV fights. It has 1,000 videos, totaling 18 hours, and is captured mainly through CCTV and mobile cameras. We use this dataset exclusively to replace our fights detector. It's a fight-specific dataset. So all the other concepts, they remain the same. The first experiment that we did was simply using this dataset as a test set for our method. So here we can see the 3 methods used by the authors of this dataset, and they only use the mean average precision as a metric, so we use this metric also to compare it. Our methods performed worse than them, but we trained these networks with a movie dataset and are testing the results with an entirely different dataset here. Even in our fusion network result, we had a better result with a fusion network than with their C3D one. And this result tells us that the fusion is better than the individual detector, even when tested in different specific datasets. But our intentions here is to use this dataset to replace the inputs of our fight detector, and then we train it again. So when we compare our results training the fights detector with a specialized dataset and testing with our more general movies dataset, we not only get a better results for the fights detector itself. This is our original training, and using this specialized training we get a better results for the fights detector. And our fusion network also went up in accuracy and in the mean average precision too. So this is the last big step to show that this method not only is robust when tested with other data sets, but this method can be improved by another data set. Each step of this work resulted in a different published paper. The first one detailing the first steps to break down violence concept into more objective ones had our first attempt at input manipulation with the trough combinations. It was presented in NARIS conference in 2018. In 2019, we presented our work with the fusion network and the comparison between both the C3D and the LSTM networks in ICASP. And in 2020 also presented in ICASP our results with our visual and audio features, and how using both is better than just one modality of features. Finally, this year we had these last results with a specialized network and everything before it accepted in the Journal of Visual Communication and Image Representation. To finish it up, we can answer our research questions. So, how to define violence in terms that a computer can understand. Breaking down this highly subjective concept of violence into smaller, more objective ones, we can better use computational tools to classify violence in general. We also saw that if we first detect features that are specific to a subconcept before and then fuse them later, we can train a network to understand violence better than if we just try to train it based on a subjective definition. So the way these kinds of violence interact, we can put them together and we train a network to understand how they interact to classify violence. And finally, we have a robust method that accepts the inclusion and removal of not only visual and audio features, but whole concepts as well. If we want to detect different types of violence, like car crashes, for example, we can plug these features into a fusion network and it will just use this as another set of features to classify violence. We can also remove some features which are just non-relevant, like sounds, if in a CCTV dataset. So with this, we have two main paths for future works. That is using other specialized datasets, not only for fights, but for every other concept. The challenge here is the lack of annotated data. We did not train with other datasets because there were none big enough available with other types of violence subconcepts. That is why one of the future paths is to use self-supervised learning techniques that can use a small amount of annotated data to extrapolate labels for the rest of the dataset. So this, we can see that automatically detecting violence is a big challenge, and with this work we sought to not only discuss how we're able to do this, but how can we better define this problem to ourselves before we train a machine to do so. I want to thank CNPq, CAPS for funding this research, and I see and Ricardo for making this possible. Thank you.